Anyway, back to the show. Our first speaker today is Dr. Troy Innocent, whose work connects people and place through urban play. Working with the city as a material, his work traverses the analogue and the digital spaces that we live in. He calls his approach to speculative design reworlding, as it reimagines the creative, linguistic, cultural, and social diversity of our world. He explores multiple ways of being in his works of design, sculpture, animation, sound, light, and installation, using methods of multi-platform storytelling that connect objects with their environment to build speculative worlds and games people can play. Troy is the creator of 64 Ways of Being, an innovative augmented reality platform for listening, playing, and exploring cities through new eyes, and leads a 3-year study on post-pandemic impacts of creative placemaking. Please put your hands together for Dr. Troy Innocent.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim. Thanks, Jim, and good morning. Yes, indeed, I am Dr. Innocent, and I'm going to be talking about play, but play about place. But first, I'd like to acknowledge the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung peoples on whose land I live, work, and play, from the Eastern Kulin Nation, back in Naarm, Melbourne. And of course, acknowledge any First Peoples here and their elders, past, present, and emerging. So, tēnā koutou, kato nā. Thanks for the invitation to be here. I'm going to present quite quickly because, you know, it's first thing, and what you need is an intense presentation first thing in the morning. But also I have a lot to share because essentially I'm going to be talking about the work we've been doing in the Future Play Lab over the past 2 years, coming out of 2 years of Melbourne lockdowns. So it's really been quite a ride. But first, a little bit more about myself. Thanks, Jim, for the fantastic introduction. I work across a number of different roles. I'm an artist game maker. I'm also a play designer, an urban play scholar. And 1 month before Melbourne's first lockdown, formed a lab called the Future Play Lab. So we have this memory of being in that space, and then 1 month packing up everything up, and coming back 2 years later, and all the plants had died, and we had to start again. But we continued online and developed a lot of ideas, and in fact shifted our thinking, as many people did during that period of the COVID pandemic, and started to look at because I started in playable cities, and this is a particular form of practice that, kind of going way back, was a counter to smart cities, thinking about how we connect people in place rather than just technologically control or surveil our urban spaces. And so this led to thinking around future forms of play, and particularly a design method called speculative design. And this is a fantastic tool or approach, rather, to imagining possible futures, possible alternative futures. So while I'll be talking about play and showing lots of images of people playing, there is a serious side to this practice. And that comes out also with our work with local government, which is around this method of creative placemaking, which put simply means involving artists, designers, and other creative people in the processes of creating place. So instead of starting with a master plan and then doing wiping a place and then putting in this overall vision, it's a more incremental bottom-up experimental approach that typically, when done well, involves communities and consultation. So this talk is really about responding to that what I would call the disruption, or the opportunity of disruption of 2 years of lockdown, and looking at this city as a solution to some of the challenges that are facing us. These can be the COVID pandemic, these can be the climate crisis, these can be also natural disasters, all of the things that are kind of floating around us today. So yeah, this talk is about play, but it's also about these, when you're in urban spaces, this is what is happening in those spaces. And so cities have a role to play in that. So our main focus is really looking at how these spaces can be kind of more resilient and inclusive places. And really this response works with all of these kind of components. It's a particular method that we've developed in the lab. And I'd like to thank and acknowledge the first 4 speakers yesterday who really outlined, the problem. So I'm going to skip over that part. It's going to save me a lot of time. But we have this, kind of incredible change that's happening in the world. And I'm not saying that I'm not kind of one of those people that says, play can change the world. It's one of the methods, I think, that is able to bring people into change. And I'll kind of explain why and why I've been working with play for the last 20 or 30 years. Because play is a particular way of being that is immersive, whether it's using technology or not using technology. It's this space, this other kind of space that people go into, both children and adults. And in that unique way of being, it's a space of possibility, of imagination, of creativity. And it also has this intensity, so it's embodied and embedded and entangled. And within that kind of space, it opens up the world. So whereas, this is where, looking at the city, rather than seeing it as a problem to be solved, it's a space of possibilities. So when you're in a state of play and kind of intersecting an urban environment, other possibilities open up. And also it is something that is also joyful and expressive and connective. So it can, not always, but can make you feel better, which is good for everyone. So we're really interested in what I would call the special case of urban play, particularly for adults who are kind of, for various reasons, cultural, social, kind of discouraged from play, or at least, are encouraged maybe now to play as a form of entertainment in a private domestic space, but not always in a public space or in a space with others. And what we're really interested in terms of urban play are these kind of really unique characteristics that mark play as a different activity compared to children to adults. So children intuitively play, it's kind of like a work for them, it's about learning about the world, and they're immersed in it and it happens spontaneously. But unlike adults, it just kind of happens, and that's it. Whereas adults can, while it might be harder to invite or ease adults into play, adults can be more critical and reflective about play, so they can kind of almost shift between worlds. And some of the methods that we use with local government and so forth, take advantage of that. So what this means is that in the case of urban play, you're in a state of play, but you're also kind of immersed or embedded and entangled with the world itself. So this is where our kind of thinking around speculative design, which is often, responding to a fictional design brief in a possible future, is engaged directly with the world itself. So it's that, and this is this process of reworlding. I'll give some examples of this. It's an experimental form of game design, but this is the method that we've been exploring post-pandemic to kind of take advantage of that disruption in the city to start looking at, alternative ways of being in the world. And finally, also for adults, play can just be a regenerative activity and can be quite a hopeful activity. So once you see a space of possibilities, as outlined by speakers yesterday, particularly in the morning sessions, there some of these challenges, while I'm certainly not advocating that play has the kind of capacity to solve these problems, it can perhaps offer a different perspective, approach, or even just kind of a kind of boost of energy to be able to deal with the massive changes that are happening within the world. Okay, so that's the manifesto. Now let's look at this in practice. So I'm going to fairly quickly run through a series of projects that we've developed over the last couple of years, give some examples of this in practice, and these are loosely connected to 3 different themes, which I'm also going to connect back to some of the conversations around the roles of cultural institutions, public spaces, and cities as a whole. So, working with this idea of urban commons, that is, the kind of right to public space, the right to the city. The first project I'm talking about is an experiment that we ran at Melbourne Design Week earlier this year in Collingwood, working directly with this idea of reworlding. So this was a 2-hour role play experiment where people were taken through a series of very physical, playful encounters that were staged in a fictional scenario of Collingwood as it might be in 2050. And then once that was completed, they were then taken through, so that the person sitting overlooking them is a game master who's kind of running this entire session as a really light form of role play to say, well, okay, now that you've been through that, what possible world would you build? And so this is where it becomes an exercise in speculative design, but directly referencing the urban environments that we just walked through. Here is another project, in this case, working with Nawi Carolyn Briggs, who's a Boonwurrung elder and very prolific in Naarm, Melbourne, in connecting Indigenous knowledges with creative technologies, with young people, with urban spaces. So she works with the lab a lot and is a very unique individual in that she sees herself always as being in 2 worlds, both as a citizen but also as a custodian. And so sharing that knowledge here along the Birrarung, which is the Yarra River, we created a game together which was about regenerating a body of water. So this river is very much seen as toxic and polluted. In fact, it's quite clean. It's just, I won't go through the whole story as to why it is the way it is, but that's what this work was about, was kind of, again, going through different moments in time of the history of this river. And essentially the mechanic was that players would hold a vessel of water that would become disrupted and as they carried it from one place to the next. So it was their companion on this journey, and there are various interventions that happened to that. So as players were walking along the course of the river, they're both generating their own stories by holding this companion and also stopping for moments of reflection that go through acts of reworlding, of reimagining what the river could be. And in fact, just as an aside, working currently, last week I was in Otatahi Christchurch, where of course the river has been regenerated. So it is possible to kind of reconnect these kind of bodies of water back into our cities. A project that we spent a lot of time kind of touring around the city was the Playful Parklet, and this is probably our most active project. So it went to 6 different sites in Melbourne. We're taking it out again next year. So I don't know if parklets were a big thing in Aotearoa, but these are temporary outdoor dining areas that there are literally hundreds of these that popped up in Melbourne during the various lockdowns because of outdoor dining and so forth. So, but they started as a form of tactical urbanism. So we reclaimed these as a pop-up festival space. So kind of travelling this around the city and attracted about 30 creatives into there. So we commissioned some projects when it launched in 2021, but then as it went to each place around the city, new projects, both existing and new, were drawn to it. And so it became this kind of hub for experimentation with public space. And so there's an example of one of the games that was made. Oh, and this is a joke that no one except someone from Melbourne might get. We had PSOs, which are our kind of like people that fine you on public transport, but we called them playful spaces officers. So it was reinvented the PSO. And so there was a lot of musical play in these environments as well, because one of the ways that you bring adults into play is through familiar kind of ways in, like dance and music. So I'm really going to accelerate now, talk quickly about some digital interpretation work. So this is probably a method that intersects maybe with a lot of work happening in mixed realities and with museums and so forth. This project, just quickly going back, 64 Ways of Being, is an app which was funded by Creative Victoria to create journeys through different environments in Melbourne. So this is the Nagi tree, which is a significant boomerang site in St Kilda, but it's really fraught. It's right up against the road. So we wanted to reimagine that and commissioned artists and musicians to kind of create this extended reality experience around that space, scribbly gum moths moving through the environment, musical play, and also explaining what a Nagi tree is. It's a kind of site of ceremony and celebration and connection. So it's a mobile phone-based digital interpretation. Really quickly, we also launched one of these experiences in Collingwood, and this is at Collingwood Yards, a creative space kind of in the centre that was once a former school, so kind of looking at how we can embed people in that space. So you're getting a sense of what a journey through 64 Ways of Being is like. And as I mentioned, this is the reason I was in Otatahi Christchurch last week, is we're developing this through the Play About Place project to also reinterpret the CBD space, but leading out also into the red zone as a way to kind of defamiliarise and reconnect people with the city in a new way. So I won't go through the technology here. I mean, I think everyone's pretty familiar with how AR works on a mobile phone, but the main method is very contextual. So the idea is that as you're walking through these spaces, you're not just kind of landing at a site and getting some graphics on screen. There's a journey that takes you there. So this was a collaboration with a live arts collective who brought a lot of theatre and storytelling methods into that process, so that as you're moving through the space, you're engaging with place and you're being keyed into place. You're slowing down and connecting with place. And so while there is augmented reality, a lot of it is actually listening. And this listening is geofence, so as you kind of arrive at a particular laneway, the theme in Collingwood Fitzroy, because there are also so many other immersive experiences there, we went into a space that hadn't been explored, which was this labyrinth of laneways and so forth in between Johnson Street and Brunswick Street and Smith Street was a kind of little block and connected 8 different languages to that space. So the theme here in this particular journey was essentially a labyrinth of language. So as you're walking through these spaces, you're hearing stories and words not only in English but also in 5 or 6 other languages. And so the project I'm going to finish up on is Urban Play School, and I'm going to move through this super quickly because this is really more of a provocation rather than, so I've kind of explained our method, I've explained some of the work that we're doing in the lab. This approach to urban play, I think, is relevant to museums, libraries and universities as public institutions that interface with the city. And I have a colleague in the lab, Dale Leokier, has written a book called Libraries as Playgrounds, looking at how libraries have opened up as public spaces and become more kind of porous in terms of how their knowledge seeps in and how communities kind of engage with them as part of public and social life. So Urban Play School is a project that we're developing have developed at RMIT University. So RMIT is right in the middle of the city. It is really open to the city. There's lots of space around it. I'm going to really quickly, not going to call out these games in particular. I'll just give you an idea of what we did in Bowen Street with students. And this idea of urban play school was really kind of bringing in those themes of urban play that I was outlining earlier. While this was about student engagement, but also about how we could make a playable campus that was more inclusive and resilient, and created a sense of connection. And so urban play can have these roles, and as I was saying before, it can be about almost like an approach to survival. It's regenerative. It's a kind of a mode of adaptation, through understanding systems, getting to know, being keyed into the logic of play or a game system, which might create a more connected or kind of way of being in the world. And it's also about change. So one of the things that drew me to play originally, when actually there weren't many books about it, was one from last century, which is very Eurocentric, but and has been challenged recently. But there's this really interesting assertion that it makes, and that play precedes culture. So essentially, for adults, play is about exploring other possible worlds, other possible ways of being in the world, other ways of connecting with humans and more than human. And this is what we're exploring through Urban Play School. With all kinds of experiments. And a lot of these, this is, I won't go into the whole how the lab intersects with teaching and engagement, but this is this kind of holistic approach that we're looking at in the university, and the model that I would advocate also for museums and libraries and other public institutions, to engage people in active forms of play that connect not only to the interior spaces of those institutions, but also to the city around them, to create sense, possibility and community and connection. So thanks for listening. If you're interested in finding out more, we have there'll be a new website at that URL at the moment. It's a bit out of date at the moment, but I'm going to finish with an invitation where it's just me really, running a workshop tomorrow. If you're interested in engaging with these methods of urban play, there's still, I think, space for maybe 3 or 4 people to join the workshop that's happening here at the museum and outside, weather permitting. So yeah, come and join us tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. Thanks for listening. Nō reira, tēnā koto, tēnā koto, tēnā koto, katoa.
Thank you so much. Should we take a seat? Tēnā koe, Troy. Thank you so much. So much to dig into there. We'll have a few minutes for. Oh no, I dropped your umbrella. Shh, it's a secret. We'll have a few minutes for questions. So if you have a question, please put it in Slido with the code NDF23. There's so much exciting work that's going on there. There's so much that's happening in Melbourne. What makes a city or a physical environment more or less conducive to fostering urban play?
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question. So big thing that comes up is permission. And so one of the things that we look at, especially with Urban Play School, is giving people permission. So it began as a way to engage postgraduate and undergraduate students at the university with the invitation. So that an invitation to play with what is public space. And of course, cities can be very closed, they can be very open, and of course, a city is not just one thing, it's many things. So one of the things that happened, which in Melbourne in particular, which had this so-called longest lockdown in the world, was that people were, the city is very centralised, and so all of the kind of train lines, essentially businesses, everything is kind of focused on the city centre. And what happened during the pandemic was that people were pushed out of that centre and started to discover their local neighbourhood, their local place. So I had this, this experience of realising that most of my engagement with the world prior to that disruption, that kind of reset, was walking out the door and kind of closing off, and then really not opening up again until I get to my workplace. And then as I was working from home and realizing there were birds and other things on the street, it became more permeable, more kind of a shared space. And so that sense of openness is what allows this to happen. Now, of course, the other thing is, from a more practical perspective, because that's a psychological perspective, and I think that's what is quite critical for adults is shifting just their way of seeing the world. I think that's what play, in terms of as a method, or as part of this toolkit for adapting to climate crisis and other challenges, brings, is of course the permission from local government. So the catch cry after lockdown became temporary as the new permanent. So whereas this idea of previously you might have to do 2 years of planning before you do anything in public space, suddenly local government was saying, oh, well, all right, yeah, you can do that for 2 weeks. We'll just see what happens and see who comes along and see, and of course that changes the whole fabric of because there are all of these opportunities to do that. People started experimenting with that, coming from different disciplines, landscape architecture, game design, also from performance and theatre and so forth, and started to realise that public space was something they could play with and experiment with. But most critical, so this is a really long answer, but
it's a thorny question.
Yeah, that's right. But most critical is what the culture that we're trying to create around urban play school, which is spaces that are inclusive and resilient, so that kind of confidence to be in the world, which you don't. I mean, you can't take that for granted, because there's, depending on how the world sees you or how you think the world sees you, you may feel kind of terrified to be in public space, for example, let alone kind of feel like playing in that space or feel like you have some agency to change that space. So those qualities are really the most important, and that's what we hope to achieve with the work in the lab.
Absolutely. Another question that's coming in is about how museums and libraries have been able to sort of move away from being focused on the building as the institution being one and the same, to sort of a more expansive view of how they can meet their communities out on the streets and come and play. How are museums and libraries able to move away from one building and out into the rest of the space?
Yeah, I mean, this is a fantastic question. So there's a really good case study, which, because it's not my book, I can't recall the exact location, but in this book, Libraries as Playgrounds, of a library that literally had a walled structure, and they had to change the architecture. So there's that physical infrastructure piece, but then there's the invitation again around permission of, well, what is this for? So I mean, libraries have done great work around this in terms of, well, it's not just a place to go borrow a book, but it's a place you can go to play a game or make something, go to a workshop, that type of thing. So all of those things. But then, yeah, I mean, I guess looking at ownership around the space, around the library, State Library in Melbourne is a good example, because it has the grass out the front, and of course it has also originally just had one classic entrance, and now it's been remodeled to have these multiple points of entry. So it's about this kind of decentering again of the space. Yeah, I mean, it's really the invitation. A lot of people are waiting for that invitation to be part of public life, but they don't know how or where or what. And so diversity is really key here, because it's not like there's just one type of person that lives in a city. You've got to have 30 or 40 or even more, kind of like different modes of engagement and activity. And so another example, of course, is ACME, which has also gone through that. It started as a kind of permeable space, but then during the pandemic, it kind of learnt from how public had interacted with the physical structure of the building, and reset that again and created other ways, which is even more kind of fluid and embedded in the space of Federation Square, and of course connecting with the spaces around that. But yeah, workshops.
Fantastic. Final question, yes, no, is there such a discipline as rural play?
Oh, yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, I didn't get to mention it, but we're doing this project at the moment. So I showed a whole bunch of examples in urban environments we're creating a kind of choose-your-own-adventure experience in the Dandenong Ranges, because they've got this project called Nguruk Baring, which is resetting 30 kilometres of trails, which is not quite rural. I guess that's peri-urban, really, but of course, once you get out into rural spaces, you've got a lot more freedom. I mean, I grew up with raves and bush doofs and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, there's a direction there. In fact, 2 weeks ago, I was at a LARP, live action role play, out in Warrandyte, which again, it's not really rural, but yeah, I mean, you don't need to have a city to play.
Fantastic. We'll have to get you back another time for the rave/play crossover. Here I have a present for you. It is an NDF branded blunt umbrella, suitable for
fantastic
Wellington weather such as today, and I assume Melbourne weather as well. Everybody please give a huge round of applause to Dr. Troy Innocent.